Hello there, welcome to this CNBC Africa special coming to you right here from Rwanda. My name is Eugene Anangwe. Over the next 45 minutes or so, we'll be taking a closer look at the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. And of course, the theme is moving from vision to action. And of course, let me just bring on board some of our panelists that are going to be talking to us a bit about this. Paulus Noah, who's a member of the African Union Advisory Board on Corruption. Thank you so much for joining us on the program. Also with us, who's not new to CNBC Africa, Patience Mutesi, Country Director, Trademark East Africa in charge of Rwanda. Thank you for joining us on the program.
Thank you for having me.
And also with us in the program is David Luke, Coordinator, African Trade Policy Center. Thank you for joining us on the program.
Thank you.
Right, and so just to get this conversation on, from March 2018, the agreement was signed historically right here in Rwanda. And of course, a lot of people have been following closely. 49 countries so far have actually put pen to paper to the agreement. And of course, only 12 out of the needed 22 African countries have ratified this particular agreement. I want to start with you, Luke, because of course we know the magnitude of corruption when it comes to trade matters. But before we get deeper into corruption matters, let's talk about your thoughts as far as the speed that has been taken to get to where we are today. 49 countries signing out of 55, 12 ratifying between March and today. What is your thought? What is your take on that speed that has been taken to get here?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I think Africa leaders are realizing that there is really a need for free trade to be enhanced. Unlike in the past when people were doing things at the individual trade levels. Yeah, I think that is what made them. The other thing again is that there is a realization that development can only come through integration, particularly of the trade. That's what I can say why there is such a speed, even though it's still a concern why some member states of the continent have not yet come on board.
Right.
Yes.
And we'll be taking some time to talk about that.
That's a question perhaps that we need
to tackle.
Interrogate
in the program. Patience, as Trademark East Africa, your role majorly has always been to facilitate trade across East Africa. Now we're talking continental-wise, Africa. Let me read your thoughts as well. And the same question that I asked Noah here about the speed, the pace. Looking at those numbers that we have today, do you see us achieving that aspired dream of the vision bearers of this African Continental Free Trade Agreement?
EAC has a lot to teach the rest of Africa, the rest of the continent. Lessons that what we've learned in facilitating trade in East Africa is that people understand that there's an incentive in looking at the wider market. So instead of looking at Rwanda with 12 million people, I could produce for 160 people within EAC. And now we're talking about 1.2 billion people in Africa. There's no doubt that there are benefits to it. But I think one of the key takeouts that we had from this conference was that even as we're talking about ratification, we have 49 governments that signed, we have 12 that have ratified, but then we have to go beyond that and think, after ratification, how do we actually start to implement? We have to be thinking, what action plan do we have in place? But in terms of benefits, I think everyone recognizes this. There was a talk about a survey that was done by residents in Africa. And what came out of that is that most of the Africans, at least 60%, recognize that the CFTA is a good thing for Africa. Right. So that's a good starting point. The business people see the benefits in it. The people see the benefits in it. Do the government see the benefits? I think that's the biggest question.
A big question mark from Noah, taking also the same president and also asking a good question, which we'll also interrogate. Let me just bring in Luke now. Luke, from where you sit, a lot has been said at that meeting that took place here in Rwanda concerning the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. And most people have been asking, the business leaders who have been meeting in that particular conference, what more can they do? Because the implementation only happens when 22 out of the countries that signed ratify this deal. So if they don't, then the implementation might not take place. So what more would you have done? Or what more were you targeting to do?
When we should not be too fixated. 12 countries as of date ratified. You're not counting the processes that has still in progress. And we know that there are at least 15 to 18 ongoing ratification processes. Different parliaments work at different speeds, have different requirements, etc. So you should not expect that all the ratifications will come in at the same time. They will be staggered because of all these different processes. But as I said, we know that there are about 15 to 18 active ones. So if you add, even if you add 15 to 12, you have 27, so you're over the line. But, don't forget that this was a deal that was negotiated among African governments. They sent their people, they sent their trade experts to negotiate this deal. So it only follows that having negotiated it, they will, follow through on the next step, which is to ratify it. But that will take time, and it's not unusual in trade for trade agreements for there to be a bit of time, a year, 18 months, to be ratified, for the ratification to take place. So I am confident that this is going to happen. It's going to happen, as Patience just said, that survey. We know it was not a scientific survey, but 36 African countries participated, and the vast majority were in favor of this deal. There's momentum behind this deal, and it's going to happen.
Let me just speak from what Patience asked. The business community is saying that we want this thing. It's good for us. We have the commitment to actually follow through this. But the question that she asked, which I want to pose back to you before I take the microphone away from you for now, is the place of governments in actually ensuring that this is implemented. And talk to me about your perspective from where you sit. When you read the mood, when you read the commitment levels, do you see it there? Is it sufficient enough to take us home?
Yes, I think, of course, each country is different, and if you like, the political economy set up and all that. But nonetheless, my sense is that governments want to make sure that they benefit from this deal. And they want to make sure that as these markets are being opened, that they're doing their part, the infrastructure, the cross-border facilities, the support to the businesses, especially the SMEs. So there's a lot that is happening at the same time. But all this would not be happening, and with the intensity and the commitment, without the dynamic. And the dynamic is the trade deal, because the trade deal focuses everybody's attention that we need to move quickly to benefit from this thing. So it focuses attention. Everybody is talking about reforms, about improving border crossings, about infrastructure. I mean, now you cannot open an African newspaper without seeing these issues coming up. And it all has to do with that things have to be done differently now on this continent. And just my last point on this, the pressure on the governments, the demographics, the young population, finding them jobs. Every president is facing that pressure, and they understand that it won't happen just by doing what has been done in the past, that new approaches have to be tried. And partners are saying the same. They're telling us that, look, our development assistance is a catalyst. What will do it is trade and investment. And this is what everybody has seen other places in the world. So I think it's very clear. It's no longer rocket science. We all understand, and governments, I think, are moving in that direction.
We've had the dynamics that are involved here. We are talking about people saying we want this and we want it now. But trade experts will tell you trade deals are not negotiated in that sense. It takes time, and which is understandable. We need to actually take time. But the other dynamic is that we're dealing with many other players here. We're talking about 55 African countries if everybody is to come on board, and all of them having different contextual issues within their own uniqueness in their countries. How do you see those working around the clock to make this deal work? What sort of headache do you think they're having, and what sort of painkiller would you be recommending for them to actually handle these dynamic issues that are really, really complex?
Somehow complex. It's not something that has to be done overnight, as you correctly put it. The momentum has already been realized, but it is a process. As correctly said, that there are different rules that have to be followed by different countries because the rules are not yet harmonized. As a result, they have to work on this again so that they will be able to find a common platform. And then before they do that, they also look at what are the benefits. Each country is trying to look at what are the benefits that it will achieve from that. Because the concern, as it was said, is more about majority of the youth especially unemployed. And the things cannot remain the same. We have to become innovative and come up with some policies or rules that are really facilitate the process of free trade integrations without hiccups. And also to make sure that cheating is not part of the process.
Right.
Because the moment it's allowed to become part of the process, I think we may not achieve the benefits that we expect to achieve from this good idea of free trade.
How would you define that cheating in your own perspective? In this
definitely that is corruption. That is corruption.
Right.
And this issue of corruption is a cross-cutting issue. It's a cross-cutting issue, and it has to be dealt with in the first place because it is actually a governance issue.
Right.
Any rules that you are putting in place, any policy that you are developing, or even a convention that you are developing, the first consideration should be to close the loopholes that may make it possible for corruption to penetrate.
Right.
As a result of that, that should be the first step that the leaders needed to take into consideration and take very seriously as they are developing the rules that will facilitate the smooth trade, free trade integration system.
Right. Patience, in the beginning of this conversation, you did say that the continent has a lot to learn from the East African region as far as integration is concerned. From those components of complexity that I just mentioned when I was asking Noah that particular question, what do you think the continent can learn as it integrates with itself from the East African community?
We should not undermine the complexity that comes with a multiplicity of trade agreements that already, or RECs that already exist within the region. One of the things that we learned is that, if you're operating in a REX that already has countries that belong to different trade agreements, if I could call them that, it becomes really, really complex to implement the next phase that you're talking about. Specifically here, if you look at EAC, you're talking about some countries belonging to at least 3. You have some that belong to SADC, they belong to EAC, they belong to COMESA. So making sure that all these trade agreements are actually aligned and that their implementation is coordinated is where the complexity comes. So now we're going beyond the COMESA, we're going beyond the TFTA that was being negotiated between COMESA, EAC, and SADC, and now we're talking about the CFTA. We can't undermine the challenges that will come with implementation of that. And that's why it's very important that we start thinking about the action plan for implementation. The other thing is that we have to keep in mind that while we're talking about regional integration and signing all these wonderful free trade areas agreements, the motive behind that should be about production. We shouldn't forget that the reason we're doing this is to expand the markets and expand markets for the people who should be having the capital, which is the business people. So the business people should be the people who are chasing this agenda. So it's wonderful that we're talking about governments ratifying and all that, but it's actually supposed to be the businesses that are pushing for it, because businesses need to be more productive, they need bigger markets, they need to be able to source their raw materials, so they need to be the drivers for this agenda.
Are you seeing that happening, or is this something that is still a vision, is still a hope that businesses will actually push for the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement?
I think it's something that is picking up, and it's encouraging to see the conversation that's happening, because the conversation right now is about industrializing Africa. If we want to industrialize Africa, we need to also be looking at it as how will regional integration, how is the integration of Africa going to help to industrialize? So the two need to be linked. We shouldn't forget that one is driving the other. So industrialization is driving the integration agenda. So that's very important. The other thing that we shouldn't undermine is the actual challenges on the ground. Africa right now is one of the most, I'm trying to find a right word for it, but it's
a
not
diplomatic word.
It's not the most wonderfully connected continent. We have challenges moving from point X to Y. So we have major infrastructure challenges. These are challenges that even in EAC, as small as it is compared to Africa, we're still grappling with. We're still grappling with the challenge that most of our countries are landlocked. How do we connect them to the seas without the ones that are not landlocked, the ones that have access to the sea feeling challenged? You know, how do we really open up our continent? That's the kind of conversation that we need to be having. How do we utilize water within the continent? Right now, water transport is really underexploited within Africa. Air is a problem. You know, we are the least contributors to air transportation globally. So how do we liberalize the airspace? So we have to have this conversation on a daily basis beyond just ratification of the CFTA.
Great. I like that, because what it does for us, Luke, is that it makes those who thought that things look so easy, it makes it now look like, we still have a long way to go.
I think Patience has raised a number of issues. If you take the last one she raised about air transport, then she talked about connectivity, she talked about production capacity, and she talked about multiple trade agreements. Let's unpick each of them, because a lot is already happening. On air transport, the African Union has this African single air market deal that was also signed last year.
But it's still stuck somewhere.
It's beginning to unfold. You know, you have to start somewhere. You know, the first step is to bring everybody together to say they agree to a deal. And then you begin to look to see how to take, take advantage of what has been agreed. So it's not really stock as such. I'm beginning to read that all sorts of alliances are coming up, that flexibilities are being introduced as to which airline can pick up passengers where and deposit them where. You know, all sorts of things are beginning to happen under these deals, but it's going to take time for it to emerge, but these things are beginning to happen. So the problem was identified, a solution has been found, and the industry is now beginning to use that. Take the other one that you mentioned, connectivity, including on the utilization of the inland waterways, the infrastructure, etc. Now, for you to be able to exploit to put in the infrastructure and exploit the inland waterways, etc., there must be a trade sense to doing that. You cannot build a bridge to nowhere. You know, somebody has to use it, and so on. So as you're opening up the market, the governments are seeing the need to put in the investment where it needs to be put to expand the market. So, so it all is going together. It's not, these are not things that are going to happen in a flash, but it is, Take the productive capacity issue that Patience also raised. One of the things that happens when you open up your market is that you're now inviting your entrepreneurs, your businesses, to grow and to scale up. Let me just give you one example. If Ethiopian Airlines was operating in the Ethiopian market, it would be a tiny internal, but because it's able to operate across the continent, it's become a global player. So your firms can only grow as insofar as your market allows them to grow. So that the issue of productivity, production, I think what we're seeing is a response which is beginning to happen. I was in the Simba supermarket yesterday, and I was looking at where the products are coming from. A lot of the products that I saw on the shelves are from within East Africa, from Kenya, from Uganda, from Tanzania, different products, your daily household products. And also, I was looking at the prices. Those are much cheaper than the equivalents coming from outside. Let me give you one example. I bought some Kuson soap from Kenya, and I look at Fa from France. The substantial price difference. So we're beginning to see in the consumption patterns, etc., which means that the production is beginning to respond to these. But Patience, the last point, Patience raised the issue of these multiple trade agreements. And actually, for us at the EAC, our thinking is that if you have a continental free trade area, really there isn't space for other free trade areas. I think it was Paulo also talked about the need for common rules, no cheating, no duplicating, etc. Our thinking is that the other free trade areas will
collapse.
Yeah, and the RECs, which are behind them, can go into deeper integration. And this is also happening. That's why I'm saying we're not starting from scratch. East Africa community is a customs area, which is a deeper liberalization than what we would have continent-wide. And not only in terms of trade, but also sectoral coordination, sectoral policies, etc., for East Africans as part of that community. So you could say the same for SADC, you could say the same for COMESA, for ECOWAS, that there's scope for them to go deeper in addressing these sorts of issues, the productive capacity issues, connectivity issues. So there's a role for the RECs. But in terms of a level playing field throughout the continent on trade, quite frankly, for me as an economist working in this area, I don't see the scope. And actually, we have, our own analysis shows that tripartite is dead. There is no rhyme or reason for tripartite with the AfCFTA. Mm-hmm. And I think that some countries are beginning to realize this. There have only been 4 ratifications of tripartite so far. They need 14 to enter into force. And they have taken 2 years to get to 4 ratifications. The AfCFTA has taken 8 months to get to 12 ratifications. So that could also tell you what is going on here, that the countries themselves are realizing that they need to stop this duplication and have a common approach. And that's what's really going to help to liberalize and open up the trade in a much more predictable way and avoiding the confusion that Patience mentioned.
I don't know what Patience thinks on this when probably you hear that probably in the near future the East African community would have to probably be collapsed so that we don't duplicate COMESA, for example, and any other regional blocks that we've always seen out there. Some people would be like, yes.
East African community does not have to be collapsed. It will grow. It will grow in other directions. Other than just trade liberalization. There are many, many other things, good things that are already happening in the East African community that can be scaled up, and that does give it a role, including as a question of
your point. Which ones do you think would need to maybe just lose way to avoid duplication?
Couple of quick examples. Yeah. Trade liberalization is essentially about liberalizing the tariffs. But you also have non-tariff barriers. You have issues relating to standards, etc. Those are best dealt with locally. Locally meaning on the ground. So that alone is a huge scope of work for any regional economic community like the EAC. And the second example I mentioned, common sectoral policies on agriculture, on industry, on infrastructure, and so on. These are best tackled not at a continent-wide level, but closer to the ground, because these are the solutions are best found at that level.
So as we're thinking about the ratification of the CFTA, are we looking at these negotiations actually happening at a country level, or is it going to be at a REX level, if we're going to do it effectively? Because if we're talking about a CFTA that's going to come and to some extent dismantle the REX, how do we then use or leverage these RECs to negotiate for the CFTA?
No, the CFTA was negotiated by countries. This was the member states of the African Union negotiated the CFTA. This was what they agreed, and that's the approach that they used. It's not about dismantling the RECs. Nobody's talking about dismantling the RECs. As I said, there's a lot of work for the RECs which you cannot do efficiently at the continental level. What you can do at a continental level is to have common rules on trade, to say that on this continent, this is how we are going to trade. This is where will be our tariff levels. This is what will common rules on services. That you can do continent-wide. But beyond that, you just have to go closer to the ground. And this is where there is a role for the RECs. You know, I've not heard anyone talk about dismantling the RECs. And in fact, now is looking at how what the RECs have been doing so well can be scaled up. I mean, you are working for Trademark. A lot of what you are doing cannot be done at continental level. It has to be done at border crossings, the reforms, the infrastructure, the procedures, the processes. These have to be done on the ground. You cannot do this at the continental level, and nobody is dreaming.
You find the community is even working very hard as a community to consolidate what the community is doing there. The countries that have ports, they have started expanding their port and even giving dry port to the landlocked to address the concern which was just expressed by patients here.
Right.
They are providing. They are busy expanding the railway and highway to make it possible for this free trade.
You know, you cannot create a dry port from the continental level to say that, you know, it has to be done locally because, you know, and follow the trading pattern locally.
He'll be able to share with us his own expert analysis on why it was easier for more countries that signed to the African Continental Free Trade Agreement to sign on the trade issue, but for the movement, we had very few of them. But when we come back from the break, just hold that thought, all right? Right, welcome back. Thank you so much for still being with us right here on this special edition on CNBC Africa. We are talking about the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. How do we move it from just a vision to actual implementation? And of course, we want you to speak up from where we left. Luke, I'll give you the chance to actually talk to us a bit about your own analysis and probably give us also the way forward when we're talking about liberalization of movement. I mean, our opening up our borders, we talked about that in the first break. And so why do you think most of the countries that signed agreed to do trade, but most of them did not sign to that one on the movement of people?
It's a very sensitive issue for many countries. And you can trace it back to the fact that they're dealing with huge numbers of unemployment. So that's where the fear is coming from. And more broadly, generally, we live in a world where there's a lot of sensitivity these days to any form of migration. But I think we can all agree that these fears that should not define the policy. You know, you cannot live by fear. You know, you have to live in looking at solutions. And I think the other colleagues who have spoken, Patience and Paulos, are quite right in saying that we need to open up the continent if you are going to actually benefit from the trade agreement. But you know, the issue is fear. And I think more needs to be done to make our governments understand that opening up does not mean that you'll be flooded. You know, in fact, there are steps that could be taken. You can give a visa for 90 days, and then you can ask after 90 days if you're not doing anything productive, you're out. You know, so there are ways of staggering these things. There are, you know, policies that could be put in place to respond to these. But you know, for the time being, it's mostly fear, and we should not be afraid.
Right. And since we need to let you go, I'll just give you a chance to actually just talk to us about just a few pointers that you could be sharing if the leaders who are actually working around the clock, I know you're one of them, to actually see the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. What is it that you'd be telling them that needs to be done apart from what we've already spoken about so far? Key pointers, just 3 or 4.
I think also they need to ensure that economies are being run in a sound manner, not having macroeconomic imbalances and so on, high rates of inflation and so on. It discourages entrepreneurs to actually look to see how to plan a good business, develop a good business plan when things are going awry. So thankfully, many of the African countries showing a stable macroeconomic policy frameworks. I think that's going to be important as well going into the future. I think everybody talks about interest rates, that these are relatively high, the cost of borrowing and so on. I think again, solutions that could be found to these common problems. So in other words, as we deal with all these issues that have been mentioned, infrastructure, free movement of people, productivity, rationalizing multiple trade agreements, etc., we should not forget the task of managing the economy in a sound way that gives people confidence. Paul has also talked about corruption, cheating, and all this governance. I think we also need to continue to work on that front as well.
When Patient mentioned some of the challenges that we have, and he did say that we at least have started from somewhere. But I want to read your thoughts, Noah, especially on issues of travel, especially air travel, for instance. A lot has been said about how expensive it is to even travel within the continent compared to traveling outside of the continent. For example, in Kenya, for instance, coming from Nairobi to New York, for instance, you wouldn't even spend over $1,000, for example. It's about $800 and something to travel, if my numbers are right. But if you're traveling from Juba to Nairobi, some people have even mentioned quoted figures of even up to $1,000 and going towards $1,500. So much as we have started from somewhere, how do we fast track this? Because the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement is not just about trade, it's also about movement, free movement. And how do we make it easier for people to move within the continent, yet it is more expensive to travel within our own continent as opposed to going outside of the continent?
It is just frustrating as well. You know, we needed to improve on this air travel if we are serious about free trade, because you needed to make the traveling so easy to move from one country to the other. And not only that, we have also to increase the airlines on the African continent so that we'll be able to travel. I think David has mentioned about this process of African airline having already been kicked off, and even though there are some challenges, I think the fact that we have started, that is already a good indication.
It's a good indication.
I think it's a very good indication.
Right.
Because, you know, traveling, roads, communication, those are very important requirements for any free trade to be realized, to take place.
Right. Patience,
without
how do you
those
fast track this from trademark East Africa? How do you, should it be an issue of a carrot and stick, or just carrot when you talk to partners, when you talk to governments from a trademark point of view as far as facilitating this travel is concerned? What sort of conversations are happening so far?
So there are two things here. There's liberalizing the airspace in Africa, but then there's also the willingness of these governments to sign the protocol for free movement of people. You saw that there were more numbers of, there were more countries signing for the CFTA, free movement of goods. But then when it comes to movement of people, they're not very quick to take it up. So how are you going to liberalize the airspace, and yet on the other side, you're not liberalizing the movement of the people? So we need to look at the two hand in hand. And I think one of the points that I just wanted to give a different perspective, because Paul has said in his remarks that we probably need more airlines in Africa. I would argue that instead of more airlines, we just need to make sure that the ones that exist are more profitable, more efficient. So what that means is that we need to get more access to open up to more markets, to open up to the existing airlines. Why should it be so easy, much easier for the Emirates to get landing rights in an African country than Kenya Airways or Rwanda or Ethiopian Airlines? Why don't we just open up the African market to local African airlines? That's where the problem is. And together with that, also push for free movement of people. And I would like to agree with David that I think a lot of progress is being made. We now have Botswana that has agreed to let Africans come in to get visas on arrival. So as this momentum picks up, my hope is that we'll get to a point where there's actually free movement of people. It's one thing that baffles my mind. I don't understand why somebody cannot just get up and go to Chad or to, I mean, if I pick up an idea, if I want a partnership in Niger or Liberia, or anywhere. Why can't I just get up and go?
We know that the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement is actually supposed to remove obstacles to movement of goods and services across Africa. And of course, there are a lot of people, and before we even go to where we are right now in this conversation, you did mention the East African community has actually done a lot that can be borrowed from some of the achievements already made. But the EAC, according to people who are looking and doing comparison, contrasting, they say that we have not been able to actually do much as we've had some strides being made, but we still have our challenges when it comes to the protocols that we've had not being implemented fully. Free movement of people is also not that fully done. There are a lot of some of the non-tariff barriers happening there. And someone wonders, if we have not been able to actually achieve all this fully under just East African Community member states, how are we going to be able to do this on an African scale, on a continental scale? What sort of answer would you be giving such people who are this pessimistic?
I mean, everything in life comes with challenges. The fact that there are challenges doesn't mean that you shouldn't give it a try. If you look at EAC, where we were 10, 15 years ago, vis-a-vis where we are today, there's a lot of progress that has been made. If you speak about specifically, say, goods, we're in a customs union in EAC. So right now, if you have goods that are destined for Rwanda or Burundi, one of the landlocked countries, it's a single declaration that you do at either of the entry points, the key entry points being Mombasa or Dar es Salaam. That does a lot for a business person, knowing that he declares once and the goods will come straight to the market. But when you look at services, the services industry, that's where we have major challenges. We haven't really gotten where we have to get in terms of free movement of services. And I think what we've tried to do is to make sure that there's mutual recognition of standards when it comes to services, because most of these things are not very easy to deal with. If you look at, say, legal practice as an example, the training that you go through to become a lawyer in Rwanda or in Burundi or in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, it's different. So it's difficult to get somebody who practices law in Kenya and just give him a license to come and practice in Rwanda. So what we try to do is to make sure that across EAC, we have a mutual recognition of these standards in the services sector.
How do we elevate this now to a continental level? If those who are dealing with who are working on the implementation part of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, what sort of lessons, what sort of advice would you be giving so that now, if we are to move this problem just from an EAC problem or a challenge to a continental challenge, how then would you be suggesting that things be done so that
it's not an easy process, Eugene, because even in EAC we are still grappling with it. I told you about the mutual recognition. There are a number of services where the EAC has determined to sign some mutual recognition agreements, but it hasn't really come to fruition because you have to deal with the challenges of as far as the education system. Can we have the education system in Africa harmonized? To say for you to become a lawyer, this is what you need to do. Or if I need to go to ECOWAS as an example and I'm coming to EAC, these are the additional trainings that I need to go through to practice law or to practice medicine, to become a doctor. So it's not something that you can deal with immediately. I would say the starting point is get into some mutual recognition agreements. And with that, maybe move to the next level of harmonizing the education system, which is a very, very long process, which I don't think it will ever get to a point where we say, it's done, we've now fully harmonized. Right. It's going to really take time.
It will take time. No, I want to ask you as well, what we know is that actually the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement would actually create a marketplace for 1.2 billion people for all the 55 African countries. If this deal sounds this sweet, this amazing, then why didn't everybody just jump to it and just say, you know what, this deal is good. You can't actually miss out on this. Let's all sign on it. From your own analysis, why do you think others are not jumping on this, yet these benefits that we keep pointing out look so good?
Okay, thank you. But before I come to that question, let me also touch on some of the concerns that were expressed by patients. Concern of lack of integration of some of the things to really work together. You see, one problem is that if you just do a research, you will find that the body, the AU body, has adopted so many conventions, so many charters that could have addressed some of the concerns that were expressed here. The problem that we have is that the conventions and the protocols and charters are adopted, but they find no domestication, implementing them at a domestic level, but they are already there. You can mention of the public service, Africa Public Service Charter. It's already there. Yeah. It's already there. You can also go on the issue relating to, like she mentioned, about the training of lawyers. There are some protocol agreements that are providing for all this. Yeah. They are there. Yeah. The African Court is there dealing with the issue relating to human rights and dignity and so on. But the problem is that once all these are done, people sit on their laurels and then don't implement. I think what needs to be done is to push for the domestication of what we adopt at the continental level. If we can just do that, then definitely we will find a way. Even though it's true that it's not always an easy process to finally accomplish everything, but we have to start somewhere. The fact that we have started and adopted these instruments, let us implement them. Right. What was the motive, the reason for adopting them if they find no implementation?
Do you see this as something that we need to also bring to the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, that if we agree that this is what we are going to do, if we say we have to open our borders, open them, and if you do not open, then you need some sanctions. And what sort of sanctions would you be looking at here?
Yes, I follow that reform, that agreement, that which I think is a very good one. Because we are making ourselves a typical talk shop. We do not really, heed to what we agree to. Yeah. I think that will be a very good measure. Because, I mean, that's something that will measure, it will compel the member states to do something about their agreements. Yeah, that to me, that will be very, very important. You see, most of the time, we hide ourselves behind this national sovereignty and forget that the continental body is above all this other sovereignty. It's above, it's the biggest one. And what is agreed there should find more implementation at the national level if we are serious. Now coming to the issue of why such a big market and then people are still. It is still a question of fear of unknown. These things of fear that, okay, if I jump in, maybe there will be negative consequences that are coming from this. The other thing again is the issue again of, having different way of doing business. It is another one again. People still, they are still so apprehensive, they are apprehensive, they have this pessimism about each other. Yeah. They think that if commodity has to come from a certain country in the West, it will take up the market in the East or will take up the market in the SADC, not realizing that this will strengthen the continental economy at the same time. Right. It's somehow a fear. I think these things have to be popularized. Right. At the same time, we harmonize some of these trade policies and rules so that they can speak to each other. Because if they don't speak to each other, that creates a problem as well. And of course, some other challenges were already mentioned, that you cannot open up trade when you have not opened up the movement of people. These things go together. Certainly they go together. In fact, the movement of people is supposed to be the first thing, not the free trade, not the other way around.
Right. Yes. Patience, probably just speaking from what he says, there is fear from within, and it's a fear of the unknown amongst us as Africans. But let me also ask you, because there's also some sort of reported fear by those who are in the international community of a united Africa. And so I want to know from you, what do you think a successful implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area could portend to some of those international bodies that have been actually speaking down on individual African countries. What do you think this portends to them?
That's a good question, and I would like to answer it by just starting from, I think, some of the points that Paul has made. I come from the school of thought that I think one of the things that we need to deal with is a soft issue. Can we start by dealing with issues of African identity? Can we start by looking at ourselves as one person? Because that's where I think the problem is. So when we talk about fear, why is it that if you go to, say, and I'm choosing random countries, let's say maybe it's, again, I'm going to choose Chad as an example. Why would they be scared about a product that's coming from, say, Uganda and not be scared of a product that's coming from France? Why is it easy for them to see European products and jump at them very gladly and not a product from another African market? Could it be that we've not yet taken pride in who we are as Africans, that we do not easily accept everything else that's from Africa? Do I take pride in wearing something that is made in Tanzania versus something that's made in Europe? So that's where I would say let's start dealing with the softer issues of identity. Let's see ourselves as one Africa so that Africa can integrate.
Right.
Now, once that integration has happened and bringing into perspective the issue of business, at the end of the day, what we want is more people with money in their pockets. What does that look like? It's a combination of Africans who are more entrepreneurial because they have access to unlimited capacity within the continent. It's Africans who are more innovative, Africans who have more capital and can invest in businesses. But on top of that, it's also an Africa where an external investor can look at it and it looks attractive to invest in Africa. So if Africans are pushing for value addition for, say, chocolate, we've seen endless studies about the actual benefit that goes to a cocoa farmer vis-a-vis the cost of the chocolate. It's unlimited. If Africa can come together and get these chocolate processors to come and set up in Africa, then it benefits the Africans. It doesn't matter that it's a business that was started in Europe, but you have an investor who is in Africa creating jobs for Africans with the view of a bigger market. The problem that they have right now is that they're looking at all these small countries. If I set up in Rwanda, my market is only 12 people. But if Africa is integrated, I'll set up in Rwanda, but with access to 1.2 million people. So there's a benefit there even for foreign investors. I don't think it's something that should be of concern because they have access to a larger market when they set up in Africa.
Right. And of course, when you talk about that, it brings to the issue that this agreement does. It says that African governments, African leaders will now be able to negotiate with external markets as a bloc as opposed to negotiating individually, and so probably bringing to an end that fear that actually I'll be taken advantage of. But if we go as a bloc, we then have more to benefit than going as individual. But no, people would tell you that will not work. People will tell you that is not working. And they'll tell you that, look, an individual country is actually still doing negotiations with, let's say, a country like China, for instance. All of us are going to China, knocking doors and making deals at individual country level. How do you think the implementation of African Trade and Free Area Agreement would change this? Will it even do that?
I believe that if we go there as a bloc, the benefit will be bigger than going there as an individual, because there you'll be stronger. Yeah, you are negotiating from a strong position as a continent, and the benefit that is coming from there will also be bigger for the continent as a whole. Unlike what is happening now, there is a replication of, and some of the things that they are negotiating at the national level may not necessarily be for the benefit of the nationals, or not for the national interest, because they are not much contributing to the continental integration when it comes to the continental economy. Right. Yeah, but if if we could do it as a block. You see, as we said already, that the problem here is that you fear something that you have not tested yet, and that is a problem. Can't we start with as the process has started? Yeah. Can we move forward with it and test it? And then you will find that it will be more productive, yielding more benefits than what we did not expect.
Right. So you think
will
definitely the agreement will help in dealing with that issue? That moving forward, we will now be able to say we're going to talk. But with all these dynamic issues that we all have, individual countries having individual specific needs and challenges, how do you expect to see a country, I'll also mention just randomly, let's say Kenya, having its need in a certain area, saying that, China has come knocking, and China says they want to give us this infrastructural project at this cost, and yet I can be able to negotiate this between me and China as a country, and here you are saying that no, moving forward we need to talk to China as a bloc, and so that if we have a challenge of infrastructure, let's all bring our problems to the African Union in terms of our budget needs, and then the African Union will go to China and say, you know what, you want to invest in Africa? This is the budget, and you are going to pay this bill this way, and so if we're going to pay it back, this is how we're going to pay it back. How realistic will this be, Patience?
I think we shouldn't mix the two things. At the end of the day, we're talking about an integrated Africa, but that has sovereign states. At the end of the day, there are projects that are going to be national, and there are projects that are going to be regional or continent-wide. So we shouldn't forget that if Rwanda, as an example, has a feeder road project to connect the parts of the country that are farthest to reach, I don't think that's the kind of thing that you want to take to the EU. But then if we're talking about a road network or rail network that's connecting Kigali to, say, Kinshasa, that's something that you bring to the AU. So it's not to say that each and everything has to go to the AU to negotiate. So these regional projects are the kinds of things that need to be negotiated collectively. Exactly. Yeah.
So as we close, the future, how does it look like? Moving from vision to action. Are we going to do this?
I think the future looks really bright. The starting point has to be political will. And I think by signing these agreements, 49 countries signing the agreements means that the political will needs to be there. The next point needs to be the commitment to actually make things work. That commitment will be shown by seeing an action plan to the implementation of the CFTA. The next thing is, I think I said it a little bit earlier, is let the private sector see themselves in this agenda. So it has to be, you need to have a lot of public-private dialogue. The private sector, the public sector sitting together and discussing what this really means for businesses and not leaving aside the civil society. So the opportunities are endless. But we need to have businesses and the civil society pushing the agenda and the governments listening to the people.
Right. No, I'll give you also the last word, but I'll also give you a chance to talk to what is deep in your heart, and that is the issue of dealing with corruption. A report by Transparency International did actually say that 12 out of the 20 most corrupt countries in the world are actually coming out of Africa. And of course, when you're talking business, when you're talking trade, corruption has its place in actually spoiling things when it comes to this issue. So talk to us a bit about this and why we need to deal with corruption if we even want to attract investments from outside as a continent.
Yes, fighting corruption is very fundamental. It is a fundamental issue if we really want to realize these free trade agreements. So we cannot relax on fighting corruption. The other thing, because all these programs, what you need is good governance. You need prudent management of resources. Without that, you can have as many resources, but then if the management is not prudent, then you will not make a benefit out of it. You see, we see Africa as a continent of plenty, but it can only be a continent of plenty to serve the interest of all the African citizens if resources are properly managed. Yeah. And in the management of these resources, we need, as Patience said, we need the participation of all stakeholders. You know, private sector, the business people, they should see themselves as part of the process. They cannot be out, because the moment they are out, remember that government leadership, political leadership, is only about taking decisions. But the actual people who are supposed to promote the growth of the economy are the business communities. These are the ones who drive the economies. Right. And they should be part of the process right from the beginning. Otherwise, the process may not really realize its real objective. Perfect. That's how I say it.
When I always ask this question, I was once challenged and I was told, yes, Transparency International says that 12 out of the 20 most corrupt countries in the world are from Africa, but also some of the least corrupt countries are also from Africa.
Oh, yes.
And of course, that is where we'll end this conversation. Thank you so much, Noah. Thank you so much, Patience. And also in absentia, David Luke, Coordinator, Africa Trade Policy Center, who was with us and had to leave because of other urgent matters that he had to attend to. Thank you also for watching. Thank you for being a part of this CNBC Africa special. We'll see you again. Stay tuned to CNBC Africa, where we are fast in business worldwide. As always, I'm Eugene Anangwe, signing off. Bye-bye.